listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And the IPCC just released a report yesterday. They've been meeting in Tokyo, if I'm remembering correctly. And they're talking about the possibility of sudden, irreversible, catastrophic climate change, about the economic impacts of all this, some serious stuff. Dr. Michael Mann has been at the forefront of research into climate change for a long time. He's the guy who invented basically the hockey stick. He created the graphic that is known as the hockey stick that Al Gore popularized, although Michael Mann wrote a book about it as well himself. And he is the director of the Penn State's Earth Systems Science Center. He's a climate scientist and professor. His website is michaelmann, MANN.net, and Twitter, Michael E. Mann, M-A-N-N. And Dr. Mann, welcome back to the program, or welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tom. It's always good to talk with you.
Thank you. And the title of your book was?
Oh, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars.
There you go. Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. I'm sorry, I didn't have it in front of me, and I have the book. It's good. Now, you wrote at least one, it looks like several here. I have a couple of different pieces in Scientific American, unless they just one must be just a clip of another. Why global warming will cross a dangerous threshold in 2036.
Yeah, so there was an article both online and in the April print issue, and then there was a supplementary piece that provided a little bit more of the context behind that article.
Aha, okay. Well, I have them both here. You want to give us the summary of what you had to say? Sure.
So in this piece, what I wanted to address was this notion. It's a false notion, but nonetheless, it has gotten quite a bit of mileage in sort of the sort of fringe regions of the internet, but increasingly in the mainstream media, this idea that there has been a pause in global warming, that global warming has stopped. I call it the faux pause.
We had a congressman yesterday say this on the floor of the House of Representatives, Jim Brindenstein.
Oh, it's become a standard talking point for climate change deniers and contrarians and sort of professionals in the disinformation campaign. And so this continues to be repeated, even though it's completely false. And what I wanted to do in this piece is say, well, let's suppose that that there had been a pause in global warming, even though there hasn't been. Let's suppose that because of the year-to-year fluctuations related to things like the La Nina phenomenon, there's the El Nino phenomenon, but we've actually seen more of its flip side in recent years, La Nina, and that's actually cooled the climate a little bit in recent years. It's a natural factor that will soon go away. In fact, we're already predicting a very large El Nino within the next year. But let's assume that somehow we do our best to fit these natural fluctuations in a way that downgrades our estimate of just how sensitive the Earth is to greenhouse gases. So let's assume that all that, that small decrease in the rate of warming somehow indicated that the globe was less sensitive to greenhouse gas increases than the scientific community generally considers to be the case. Well, it turns out that if you make that concession to the deniers, it turns out it buys us about 10 years, that we would cross that 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit, often characterized as a dangerous threshold of global warming and climate change. We would cross that threshold 10 years later, 2046 rather than 2036. So in fact, even if you make that concession to climate change contrarians, it turns out it doesn't lessen at all the threat that we are faced with, the prospects for potentially dangerous and irreversible climate change that that we'll have to deal with if we don't do something about the problem now.
This, whether it's 20 years down the road or 30 years down the road, this threshold, this temperature threshold, by rounding it off to round numbers, degrees C, seems a little arbitrary. Wouldn't it be, or perhaps this is how we talk about it in public, Wouldn't it be more useful to identify specific feedback loops that at a certain point become self-reinforcing and thus unstoppable? And how many of these do we need to aggregate before we've got a serious problem? And where are we relative to that?
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, that's part of, the uncertainty. You'll often hear from contrarians the notion that uncertainty somehow lessens the threat. But in fact, as you just alluded to, the uncertainties could very well, in fact, more likely will work against us, that the problem may be worse than our best models currently project, because there are potential what we call feedback mechanisms, but these are vicious cycles that we set in motion when we warm the climate. We release some of the methane that had been frozen in the permafrost, and methane itself is a powerful greenhouse gas, so we get even more warming. And we don't know precisely how much of that stuff is out there. It's somewhere in the domain of either the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns when it comes to the issue of potential aggravating climate change factors. So
you and Don Rumsfeld.
Exactly. It happens to be a good characterization of what we're dealing with here. Things that we know are missing from the models and potentially make the model projections too conservative, and those things that we haven't even thought of but still loom out there. And those are the things that keep us up at night. And so, frankly, the 2 degrees Celsius warming threshold is somewhat subjective, but we know that even taking the most conservative estimates, 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet relative to pre-industrial over a time scale of 1 century will almost certainly exceed the adaptive capacity of natural systems, of other animal species, and of us. We haven't had to deal with rates of climate change in our entire evolution. We haven't had to deal with rates of climate change as large as what we're dealing with potentially right now. And so that number is actually a conservative number, and it really isn't like there's a cliff. It isn't like, we drive up to the 2 degrees Celsius cliff and, if we go over, then there's nothing left we can do about the problem. I like to use the analogy of, a highway that is ever sloping downward, steeper and steeper, and we're going farther and farther down that dangerous highway. And you know what? We've probably missed the 400 parts per million CO2 threshold. That doesn't mean that we don't try to get off at the next exit ramp, the 420 ppm threshold. And if we miss that one, we take the next exit ramp. The problem is, the farther we go down that road, the greater that downslope of that highway, the worse impacts we commit to.
We're adding about 3 ppm per year, right?
That's right. And so if you do the math, we just passed the 400 parts per million CO2 last year for the first time. We're fairly certain that you have to go back millions of years to find CO2 concentrations that were that as high as what we've now reached. That's how unprecedented this experiment is, this uncontrolled experiment that we are playing with the climate. And if you do the math, at 3 parts per million CO2 per year, we reach that 450 parts per million level in a matter of decades. And that will almost certainly commit us to greater than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming, and likely exposes us to the risks of some of those feedback loops, some of those vicious cycles kicking in and making the problem even worse, and committing future generations to essentially irreversible changes in our climate.
That's remarkable. We're talking with Dr. Michael Mann. I understand you can be with us for the half hour?
I'm looking forward to it.
That would be great. Please stick. And welcome back. And Dr. Mann, just, I don't know if Sean explained all this to you. Right now, our commercial stations around the country are in commercial break.
Sure.
And that's a little less than half of our total listenership. But we're still on the air with our Pacifica stations, and we're still live on television, on Free Speech TV, on Dish Network, DirecTV, and cable systems all over the country. And so when we'll hit another break in 4 minutes when we rejoin the commercial stations, and I'll just very quickly recap whatever you say for those listeners who missed that.
Sounds great.
The concept of a lag time, I've seen this in a variety of different ways, expressed in different ways. I've seen formulas for it. I've seen speculation about it. I don't know to what extent it's solid or nailed down. I've heard people say that the warming, the reason why the Earth isn't as warm as you would expect it to be at 400 parts per million, or as warm as it has been in millions of years ago at 400 parts per million, is because it takes 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 or 60 years for the impact of that. It's like to be distributed around the planet. What is the lag time? If we were to stop right now and freeze at 400 parts per million, how long will the Earth continue warming before it plateaus out and we see that the essential consequence of 400 parts per million?
Yeah, and so you're right. The climate is like a steaming locomotive right now. And if we slam our foot on the brakes, it doesn't come to a stop immediately. It may take a mile down the tracks before we come to a stop. That's because of the inertia, the weight of that locomotive. Well, the climate system has what we call thermal inertia. The oceans have a huge capacity to absorb heat. And so what's happening is a lot of the warming thus far, a lot of the heating of the planet is still penetrating down into the ocean, into the upper parts of the ocean and eventually the deep ocean. And that heat will continue to penetrate into the ocean for centuries. And so the surface of the oceans won't reach a new equilibrium, won't fully respond to the greenhouse gases we've already put into the atmosphere for many decades down the road. It's what we call the committed warming. So the Earth will continue to warm up for the better part of a century, even if we stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere right now. Sea level will continue to rise for centuries, potentially for a time period as long as a millennium, because of the very slow process of that surface heating slowly sinking into the ocean. And as water is heated, it expands like other substances. And so the ocean will continue to expand for centuries, and sea level will continue to rise for centuries. The ice sheets, it turns out, also have a lot of that inertia. Once you set in motion the warming of the surface of the ice sheet and the beginning of the melting process, that sort of becomes a self-reinforcing process, and that can continue for centuries. And so right now we are committing to very long-term climate changes from the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere right now. And that's what makes this issue one of, an ethical issue in my view. We're committing future generations to changes in climate we haven't even seen yet.
Yeah, very well said. We're speaking with Dr. Michael Mann, climate scientist, professor, and director of the Penn State Earth Systems Science Center, author of The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, and his new article in Scientific American should be on the stands right now, the March issue, March 18th issue, Why Global Warming Will Cross a Dangerous Threshold in 2036. It's online as well. We'll be right back. Tom Hartmann here with you. We are talking with Dr. Michael Mann, climate scientist, professor, director of Penn State's Earth Science Systems Center. MichaelMann.net is his website, M-A-N-N. And we were just talking, sir, about the thermal inertia. About the fact that we're at 400 parts per million, but the world isn't yet as warm as it will be, even if we were to stop at 400 parts per million. We've raised the temperature of the Earth over the last 50, 60, 100 years, you correct me, whatever the number is, roughly 0.8 of a degree Celsius, a little more than a degree and a half or a degree and a third Fahrenheit. How much more of that warming are we already committed to if we were to stop emitting carbon right now? And will that push us to or beyond that 2-degree point that everybody's so worried about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so this is the procrastination penalty that we often talk about with climate change, that the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere right now will guarantee warming of the surface of the planet for decades, and it'll guarantee the warming of the oceans and sea level rise for centuries. And thus far, the globe has warmed probably closer to about 0.9 degrees Celsius. And we've probably locked in, our best estimate is that committed warming, the warming that's already in the pipeline because of the inertia of the climate system, that's probably close to 0.5 degree Celsius. So we're somewhere close to 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of the warming we've already committed to. And so if we're trying to avoid that 2 degrees Celsius warming limit, you can see how little wiggle room we have left. We're working with a 0.5 degree Celsius. And indeed, that is why we need to bring our carbon emissions to a peak now and begin ramping them down by several percent a year if we are to avoid crossing that 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit threshold, often considered the threshold of truly dangerous and potentially irreversible climate change.
Now, these numbers and statistics and this information that you've been sharing with us up to this point is relatively uncontroversial, at least within the scientific community. Let's talk about the solution side of it, where there's a lot of controversy, not necessarily in the scientific community, but the solutions are not going to come about because a scientist says, okay, here's the prescription, go fill it at your local power plant. They're going to be political, they're going to be economic, they're going to be business solutions. What, in your opinion, are the things that we should be doing to prevent a climate disaster, frankly?
Well, there's so many things that we could be doing that are no-brainers. I mean, we ought to be doing them anyways. Whether it's, engaging in activities, the way we travel, go to work or school, using, public transportation or bicycling rather than driving a car. Hey, it makes us healthier. It saves us money, and it helps reduce our carbon emissions. Being more efficient with our use of energy, recycling, reusing materials, all of those things reduce our carbon footprint, and typically they make us happier, healthier, and they save us money. So they're, low-lying fruit. I mean, we ought to be doing it anyways. And it turns out that if everybody were sort of engaged in those sort of no regrets actions that are easy enough to do, save us money, reduce our carbon footprint, we could probably make a pretty big dent in the problem. But the problem is we can't fully solve the problem by, voluntary measures alone. We need some sort of, incentive structure through, government policies that incentivize clean energy, renewable energy, that at the very least level the playing field. I mean, right now, look what we're doing. We're, providing subsidies to dirty fossil fuel energy sources that are degrading the climate and the planet, and we're not investing enough in renewable energy. And so we have this completely unlevel playing field. If we could at least level the playing field by, removing some of those fossil fuel subsidies, then all of a sudden renewable energy would be far more competitive in the marketplace. The market can solve this problem. And I agree with some of my, conservative friends that there's no reason that the market, that a market solution to this problem can't be found. The issue is making sure that the playing field is level so that the market is operating on fair terms. And right now it's not.
Well, in a very real way, one of the few industries that doesn't pay to take out their trash is the fossil fuel industry. I mean, we empty our waste baskets here, and we pay for that. We pay to have our trash taken out. I do where I live. Most of us do. The concept of paying to take your trash out is not revolutionary, radical, or controversial, and yet the trash that the fossil fuel industry is releasing into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and particulate matter and the leakage, methane leakage from fracking and whatnot, they don't pay anything for any of that, and yet all of us are paying for it in the form of flood insurance taxes and FEMA and Sandy and dead people and everything else. What's an appropriate price for that trash? What's an appropriate price for a ton of carbon emitted?
Yeah, it's a great point and a great question. And, my good friend Bill McKibben, I think, has sort of characterized this very well. We've given the fossil fuel industry the greatest subsidy ever imaginable. They are literally allowed to dump their waste into our atmosphere at no cost. How can that be possible? And here's the irony. If you look at ExxonMobil's sort of long-term strategy, economic plan, in some of the documents that have become available recently, there was a great article in the New York Times by Coral Davenport, a reporter, an environmental reporter at the New York Times some months ago, where she found that in ExxonMobil's long-term business plan, they are assuming a cost of emitting carbon of $60 per ton.
Wow.
There's $60 damage done to the planet for every ton of carbon released into the atmosphere. That means ExxonMobil has a higher estimated rate of damage by fossil fuel burning than the Obama administration, because the administration's estimate of that number is almost a factor of 2 smaller. ExxonMobil has a larger estimate of the damage of fossil fuel burning to the economy and to the planet.
Amazing. Dr. Michael Mann, you can read all about it over at his website, michaelmann.net, and his new